The first time Ruth Calloway saw the old man draw a gun, 3 armed riders were already lying in the dust, and the 4th was begging to be allowed to leave alive. But 5 days earlier, everyone in Briar Creek had laughed when she hired him. The wind never rested across that lonely part of Nebraska territory. It swept over the open grass, bent the dry wheat, and struck the walls of the Calloway farmhouse hard enough to make the windows shake at night. Ruth had once loved that sound. Her husband, Thomas, used to call it the voice of the plains. After his death, it became the sound of an empty house. Thomas had died from a lung sickness during the last winter. He had been strong on Monday, coughing by Wednesday, and buried beneath frozen ground before Sunday. He left Ruth with 200 acres, a wooden house, 1 good barn, a failing wheat crop, and debts she did not fully understand until the banker placed the papers in front of her. He also left behind 17-year-old Noah Briggs, a thin ranch hand who had worked beside Thomas since he was 12. Noah stayed even after Ruth admitted she could no longer pay him. "I have nowhere else worth going," he had told her. Ruth knew the truth. The boy stayed because Thomas had treated him like family. For 4 months, Ruth and Noah kept the place alive. They repaired fences, planted seed, fed the animals, and carried water when the creek began to dry. Then their neighbor, Landon Crowe, decided the Calloway farm belonged to him. Crowe owned nearly 8,000 acres west of Briar Creek. He had cattle, money, hired riders and friends in places where poor farmers had no friends at all. The drought had emptied most of the wells in the county, but the deep well on Ruth's land still gave cold, clean water. Crowe offered to buy the farm for less than half its worth. Ruth refused. 2 nights later, someone cut her eastern fence and drove 20 cattle into the wheat field. A week after that, Noah found one of their horses wounded by barbed wire that had been stretched across the trail. Then, on a moonless night, Ruth woke to the smell of smoke. She ran outside barefoot and watched the small storage barn burn to the ground. The flames rose high into the black sky while Noah carried buckets from the well, though both of them knew the building could not be saved. The sheriff lived 30 miles away in Cotton Ridge. He sent word that without a witness, he could do nothing. Ruth read the message twice, folded it carefully, and placed it beside Thomas's Bible. The next morning she put on her dark brown dress, counted the money hidden in a flour jar, and hitched the wagon. She had $38. It was all she had left. "I'm going to Briar Creek," she told Noah. "For supplies." "For a guard." Noah looked toward the black remains of the barn. $38 won't hire much. It has to hire enough. Briar Creek had grown around a cattle trail and a rough line of shops. The town had 1 hotel, 2 saloons, a blacksmith, and enough armed men to make trouble common. Ruth tied her wagon outside the Red Lantern Hotel and entered with her money held tightly inside her bag. The first gunman she approached was named Wade Tanner. He wore polished boots and a silver buckle shaped like a bull's head. When Ruth offered him $38 to guard her farm, he laughed so loudly that men at 2 nearby tables turned to look. "Lady, I would not stand against Landon Crowe for 10 times that amount." The second man did not laugh. He simply stared at her with pity. "Sell the farm," he said. "Crowe always gets what he wants." By the time Ruth reached the third man, whispers had moved through the room. The widow from the Calloway place was trying to hire protection with grocery money. A few men smiled. One shook his head. Someone near the bar said Crowe would own her well before the week was over. Ruth stood in the middle of the room with heat rising into her face. She had survived her husband's death. She had watched her barn burn. She had buried dreams beside Thomas under a cottonwood tree. Still, the laughter almost broke her. Then the hotel owner leaned across the bar. His name was Calvin Mercer. He was an older man with a red nose, careful eyes, and the tired voice of someone who had heard every lie men could tell. "There may be one man willing to take your money," he said quietly. Ruth followed his gaze toward a dark table near the back window. An old stranger sat alone with a cup of coffee. He looked close to 65. His coat was faded black, his hat was worn at the edges, and silver hair touched the collar of his shirt. A dark red blanket rested across his shoulders like a poncho. He did not appear dangerous. He appeared tired. One of the men near Ruth laughed again. That old crow could not guard a henhouse. More laughter followed. Calvin Mercer did not join them. His face had gone still. "I served drinks in Dodge City 20 years ago," he whispered. "There are some faces a man never forgets." Ruth looked at him. "Who is he?" "I'm not certain." But Calvin's voice said he was. Ruth crossed the room and sat opposite the stranger. The old man lifted his eyes. They were pale gray and calm, but there was something behind them that made Ruth forget every prepared word. "My name is Ruth Calloway," she said. "I own a farm 9 miles north of town. A rancher named Landon Crowe is trying to force me off it." The stranger listened without moving. "I need someone to guard my land. I can pay $38. I know it is not much." "How long?" "Until Crowe understands I will not leave." The stranger studied her face. He did not ask about the size of the farm. He did not ask how many men Crowe employed. He looked only at Ruth, as though he could see the fear she refused to show. Finally, he reached for his hat. $38 is enough." The room fell quiet when he stood. The red blanket slipped from one shoulder. 2 revolvers rested at his sides. Their handles were old and dark from years of use. Calvin Mercer gripped the edge of the bar. The stranger turned toward him. For one brief moment, the 2 men looked at each other. Calvin's face lost its color. "Elias Rourke," he whispered. The name meant nothing to Ruth. But it meant something to 3 men near the bar. Their smiles disappeared. One lowered his eyes. Another slowly stepped away from the door. Elias placed his hat on his head. "My horse is outside," he told Ruth. They left Briar Creek without another word. His horse was a gray gelding named Flint. The animal lifted its head before Elias reached the hitching rail, watching the street with the same careful silence as its owner. During the ride north, Ruth tried twice to ask about Dodge City. Both times, the words died before leaving her mouth. Elias rode beside the wagon with his hands loose on the reins. He wasted no movement. He watched hills, fence lines, dry creek beds, and distant trees as though every shadow might carry a rifle. When the Calloway farm came into sight, Noah stood on the porch holding Thomas's shotgun. He lowered it when he saw Ruth. Then he looked at Elias and frowned. "This is the guard." Elias dismounted without answering. He walked the entire property before entering the house. He examined the burned barn, the damaged fence, the well, the rise west of the wheat field, and the narrow trail coming from Crowe's land. At sunset, he returned to the porch. "Crowe will come tomorrow," he said. Ruth's heart tightened. "How do you know?" "Men like him want to see fear before they use force. He will give you one last chance to sell." "And when I refuse?" Elias looked toward the western hills, where the last sunlight turned the sky red. "Then he will send men after dark." Noah swallowed. "How many?" Elias pulled the blanket tighter across his shoulders. "Enough to believe an old man, a widow, and a boy will be easy." The next day, Landon Crowe arrived shortly before noon. He rode a tall black horse and wore a clean tan coat. 3 armed men followed behind him. Crowe stopped near the porch and looked Elias over. Then he laughed. "So this is the famous protection you found in Briar Creek." His men laughed with him. Ruth stepped forward. "My land is not for sale." Crowe's smile faded. "You have until Saturday morning." Elias stood beside the porch post, silent. Crowe pointed at him. "And you, old man, should leave before you get buried on land that does not belong to you." Elias finally raised his eyes. "I was buried once already." Crowe's men stopped laughing. Elias took one slow step forward. "Dodge City, 1878. 4 men thought they had killed me behind the Long Branch Saloon." One of Crowe's riders stared at his face. Recognition spread through the man's expression. "No," he whispered. Crowe glanced back. "What is it?" The rider's hand moved away from his gun. "That is Elias Rourke." Crowe looked again at the old guard he had mocked. This time he did not laugh. Elias held his gaze. "Saturday morning," he said. "Come yourself or send every man you have. Either way, I'll be waiting." Crowe turned his horse and rode away. Behind him, the deadline began to close around the Calloway farm. The moment Crowe disappeared beyond the western ridge, Noah turned toward Elias. "Who were those 4 men in Dodge City?" Elias watched the dust settle where Crowe's riders had passed. "Men who believed fear made them powerful." "And what happened to them?" "They learned they were wrong." That was all he said. Ruth wanted to ask more, but the look in his eyes stopped her. Whatever had happened in Dodge City had left marks deeper than the lines on his face. Elias was not proud of the name people remembered. He carried it like a weight he had never found a place to put down. He spent the rest of the afternoon preparing the farm. First, he moved the wagon across the main path leading to the house. Then he checked every window, door, fence post, and shadowed corner. He showed Noah where to place water buckets in case Crowe's men tried to burn the barn. "You will not stand beside me when the shooting starts," Elias told him. Noah's face hardened. "I can help." "You can help by staying alive." "I am not a child." "No, that is why I am telling you the truth. Courage does not mean standing where a bullet can find you." Elias led him toward the barn and pointed to the rear gate. "If they come from the west, open this gate and drive the horses into the yard. Noise and movement will break their plan. Then take Ruth to the root cellar." Noah glanced at Ruth. "She will not go." Elias looked at her. "No, she probably will not." Ruth folded her arms. "This is my home. And that is why you need to live through the night." She held his gaze. For a moment, something softened in Elias' face. "Keep Thomas's shotgun near you," he said, "but do not fire unless someone comes through the door." Ruth nodded. The next 2 days passed beneath a heavy silence. Elias slept little. Ruth noticed him sitting on the porch long after midnight, his hat low, one hand resting near his gun. Flint stood tied near the barn, ears moving whenever the wind carried a strange sound. During the daylight, Elias taught Noah how to stay calm. He made the boy unload and reload the shotgun until his hands stopped shaking. He showed him how to listen for footsteps, how to tell the difference between a horse walking and a man moving through grass, and how not to waste ammunition firing into darkness. "Most men lose a fight before they draw," Elias said. "They let fear choose for them." Noah looked at the twin revolvers. "Did you ever feel afraid?" "Every time." The answer surprised him. "But people say you were the most feared gunman in Dodge City." People tell stories because the truth is harder to live with. That evening, Ruth brought Elias coffee on the porch. The sun was sinking behind the dry hills, turning the fields the color of old gold. "You could leave," she said. "I would not blame you. I gave you my word." "For $38. Elias looked at the cup in his hands. "The money was never the reason." "Then why did you agree?" He remained quiet for so long that Ruth believed he would not answer. Finally, he looked toward the cottonwood tree where Thomas was buried. "There was a woman once," he said. "She asked for help. I arrived too late." Ruth waited. "My name frightened men, but it could not bring her back. After that, the name did not mean much to me." "Who was she?" "My sister." His voice did not break, but Ruth heard the pain beneath it. "She owned a small place outside Dodge. A wealthy cattleman wanted her land. I believed the law would protect her. By the time I understood what kind of man he was, her house was burning." Ruth's fingers tightened around the edge of her shawl. "I'm sorry." "So am I." Elias stood and handed back the cup. "That is why Crowe will not take this land." Saturday arrived under a pale gray sky. The air felt strange and still. Even the birds seemed to have left the fields. Morning passed without a rider appearing. By noon, Noah began checking the western trail every few minutes. "Maybe Crowe changed his mind," he said. Elias cleaned one of his revolvers at the kitchen table. "No." "How can you be sure?" "A man like Crowe believes backing down is worse than dying." Ruth placed bread and beans on the table, but none of them ate much. The hours moved slowly. At sunset, Elias walked outside and looked toward the hills. A thin line of smoke rose in the distance. He went still. "What is it?" Ruth asked. "Signal smoke." "For what?" "For men coming from more than one direction." He entered the house and fastened both gun belts. The old tired man who had sat alone in the Red Lantern Hotel seemed to disappear. His shoulders straightened. His movements became sharp and certain. Even his eyes changed. Noah stared at him. "How many?" "At least 6. Ruth felt the room grow cold. Crowe had not sent 3 hired riders. He had sent an army. Darkness covered the farm quickly. Elias put out every lamp except one in the kitchen, leaving it near the window to make the house appear occupied. Then he moved Ruth and Noah into the hall. "Remember what I told you," he said. Noah took the shotgun. "I remember." A horse cried out near the west fence. Then another answered from the north. They were surrounded. A voice came from the darkness. "Elias Rourke." It was not Crowe. The voice sounded older and colder. Elias stepped onto the porch. A rider sat beyond the wagon, barely visible beneath the moonless sky. "You remember me?" the man called. Elias did not answer. The rider laughed. "Dodge City remembers you, even if you pretend you buried that life." "State your business." "My business is the price Crowe offered for your head." The man moved into a strip of dim light. He was tall, with a narrow face, a black beard, and a pale scar crossing his right cheek. For the first time since Ruth had met him, Elias looked shaken. "Caleb Doon," he said. Caleb removed his hat. "I always wondered if you were truly dead." Elias' hand rested near his gun. "You should have kept wondering." Caleb smiled. "Crowe hired me because his men were afraid. He said an old gunman was protecting a widow. He did not know he was offering me the chance I have waited 18 years to take." Ruth watched from behind the door. She saw 3 riders near the fence, 2 near the barn, and another beside Caleb. There were more shapes hidden behind them. Caleb looked toward the house. "The widow can keep her land. I do not care about the well. Walk into the yard and face me, and my men leave her alive." Elias did not move. "And if I refuse?" Caleb's smile widened. "We burn everything." Noah whispered from the hall. "He is lying." Elias heard him. "Yes," he said quietly, "he is." A shot exploded from the darkness. The kitchen window shattered. Ruth dropped to the floor as glass flew across the room. At the same moment, flames rose near the hay shed. "They are setting the farm on fire," Noah shouted. Elias fired once toward the fence. A rider fell from his horse. Then every gun in the yard seemed to answer. Bullets struck the porch posts, walls, and wagon. Horses screamed and pulled against their ropes. Noah ran for the barn gate. Ruth reached for him. "Be careful." He disappeared into the darkness. Elias moved down the porch steps, firing with both hands. Each shot was slow, measured, and deadly. One gunman fell beside the wagon. Another dropped behind the water trough. Caleb stayed low behind his horse. "You have gotten slow, Rourke." Elias fired at him, but Caleb moved before the bullet reached the spot where he had been standing. Behind the barn, Noah pulled the gate open. 3 frightened horses burst into the yard. They charged between the gunmen, scattering men and breaking the line around the house. For one brief moment, Crowe's hired riders lost control. Elias used it. He crossed the yard like a shadow. 2 shots rang out. 2 more men fell. Then a rifle cracked from the north field. Elias jerked backward. Ruth saw him drop to one knee. Blood spread across his left shoulder. "Elias." He raised one revolver and fired toward the field. A hidden rifleman fell from the grass. But Caleb was already moving. He came from behind the wagon with his gun aimed at Elias' chest. Elias tried to raise his weapon. His wounded arm failed him. Caleb smiled as he pulled back the hammer. Before he could fire, Thomas's shotgun exploded from the porch. The blast struck the dirt beside Caleb and forced him behind the wagon. Ruth stood in the doorway, smoke rising from the barrel. Caleb looked at her with murder in his eyes. "You should have stayed inside." He turned his gun toward her. Elias fired from the ground. The bullet tore through Caleb's gun hand. Caleb screamed and dropped his revolver. The remaining riders began to retreat, but a new sound came from the eastern road. Dozens of hooves. Lanterns appeared beyond the fields. For one hopeful moment, Ruth believed the sheriff had arrived. Then Landon Crowe rode into the yard with 10 more men behind him. He looked at the bodies, the burning shed, and Elias wounded in the dust. Crowe smiled. "You should have taken my offer, Mrs. Calloway." His riders spread around the house. Elias tried to stand, but his strength failed. Crowe drew his revolver and pointed it at Ruth. "Now I will take the land, the well, and everything else you thought that old man could save." From behind the barn came the sharp sound of a rifle being loaded. Every rider turned. Noah stepped into view. He was not alone. Sheriff Daniel Boone stood beside him with 6 armed deputies. The sheriff raised his badge into the firelight. "Lower your weapons, Crowe." Crowe's smile vanished. Elias looked at Noah. The boy had followed his orders, but he had also done something Elias had not expected. He had ridden for help before the shooting began. Crowe's eyes moved between the deputies, Ruth and Elias. Then his hand tightened around his revolver. "No one is taking my land from me," he said. The sheriff's voice turned hard. "It was never your land." Crowe raised his gun. And the whole yard erupted again. Crowe's revolver cleared its holster, but Sheriff Daniel Boone had been watching his hand. The sheriff fired first. The bullet struck Crowe's gun and sent it spinning into the dirt. At the same moment, two of Crowe's riders opened fire from behind him. The quiet farm became a storm of gunshots, smoke, frightened horses, and shouting men. Ruth dropped behind the porch railing. She broke open Thomas's shotgun, pushed in 2 fresh shells, and searched the yard for Noah. The boy had taken cover beside the barn with one of the deputies. He looked afraid, but he was doing exactly what Elias had taught him. He kept his head down, watched the field, and waited instead of firing without a clear target. Sheriff Boone moved behind the water trough. "Crowe," he shouted, "tell your men to surrender." Crowe threw himself behind his black horse. "Kill them all." 3 of his riders fired toward the sheriff. A deputy beside Boone fell backward with a bullet in his leg. Elias remained on one knee near the wagon. Blood soaked the left side of his coat, but his right hand still held a revolver. Caleb Doon crouched a few feet away, holding his wounded hand against his chest. Caleb looked at Elias with hatred. "You should have died in Dodge." Elias raised his gun. "So should you." Caleb reached for the revolver lying in the dirt. Elias fired. The bullet struck the ground beside Caleb's fingers. Caleb froze. "The next one will not miss," Elias said. Caleb slowly lifted his good hand. Across the yard, Crowe shouted at his riders to keep fighting, but fear had already begun to spread among them. They had expected a widow, a boy, and an old guard. Instead, they had found deputies waiting in the darkness, and a wounded gunslinger who could still hit anything he aimed at. One rider dropped his rifle. "I did not sign up to fight the law." Another rider followed him. Crowe turned toward them. "Cowards!" He grabbed a rifle from his saddle and aimed at the first man who had surrendered. Before he could fire, Noah rose from behind the barn. "Put it down." Crowe looked at him and laughed. "You think you are a man because an old killer taught you to hold a gun." Noah's hands shook around the shotgun. Elias saw it. "Breathe, Noah," he called. The boy heard him through the gunfire. He took one slow breath. Crowe turned the rifle toward him. Ruth saw the movement. "Noah!" Crowe fired. The bullet struck the barn door beside Noah's head. Noah pulled the trigger. The shotgun blast struck Crowe's rifle and tore it from his hands. Crowe stumbled backward and fell into the dust. Noah stood frozen, staring at him. Elias lowered his revolver. "You did well," he said. Those simple words reached Noah more deeply than any praise he had ever received. Sheriff Boone stepped from behind the trough. "Enough." The remaining riders looked at Crowe, lying unarmed in the yard. One by one, they dropped their weapons. The gunfire ended. For several seconds, no one moved. Smoke drifted over the farm. The hay shed still burned near the fence, but the water buckets Elias had placed nearby kept the fire from reaching the barn. A horse wandered through the yard, with broken reins dragging behind it. The deputies moved quickly. They collected the guns, tied the prisoner's hands, and dragged Crowe to his feet. Crowe's face was covered in dust. "You cannot arrest me," he said. "I own half this county." Sheriff Boone took a pair of iron cuffs from his belt. "You ordered armed men to attack a widow's home. You hired Caleb Doon, a wanted killer. You set fire to property and opened fire on officers of the law." Crowe glared at Ruth. "She stole my water." Ruth stepped down from the porch. "It was never yours." Crowe looked toward Elias. "This is because of him." "No," Ruth said. "This happened because you believed no one would stand against you." The sheriff locked the cuffs around Crowe's wrists. "You were wrong." Two deputies led him toward the road. Crowe twisted around one last time. I will buy every judge between here and Cotton Ridge. Sheriff Boone shook his head. Not after your own men tell the court what happened tonight. The riders who had surrendered avoided Crowe's eyes. They had already chosen which story they would tell. Sheriff Boone walked toward Elias. The old gunslinger had lowered himself against the wagon wheel. His face had become pale, and blood continued to run down his sleeve. Ruth hurried to him. Elias, I have had worse. That does not mean this is good. She knelt beside him and tore a strip from the bottom of her dress. Her hands trembled as she pressed it against the wound. Elias looked toward Noah. How did you get the sheriff here? Noah lowered the shotgun. When I saw the signal smoke, I knew you were right. Crowe was bringing more men. I took the bay horse through the southern field before dark. You were supposed to stay at the barn. I came back. A tired smile appeared beneath Elias' silver beard. Yes, you did. Sheriff Boone knelt beside them. The bullet passed through. He lost blood, but he will live if we get him inside. Ruth and Noah helped Elias to his feet. He tried to walk without leaning on them, but his legs failed after 2 steps. You guarded us, Ruth said. Now let us help you. For once, Elias did not argue. They carried him into the house and placed him on the kitchen table. Ruth cleaned the wound, while Sheriff Boone removed the bullet-torn cloth from Elias' coat. Outside, the deputies guarded the prisoners and put out the final flames. Caleb Doone sat tied beside Crowe. He watched Elias through the broken kitchen window. For 18 years, Caleb had dreamed of killing him. Now he would spend what remained of his life behind stone walls, because Elias had chosen not to kill him. Before sunrise, the sheriff loaded the prisoners into 2 wagons. He stood on Ruth's porch with his hat in his hands. I should have come when you first sent word. Ruth looked toward the black ruins of the shed. Yes, you should have. The sheriff accepted the truth without defending himself. I will make it right. Crowe's men are ready to speak. We also found his account book. He paid men to burn the storage barn and damage your fences. Will that be enough? It will be enough to keep him away from your land for a very long time. Ruth looked through the doorway at Elias sleeping near the stove. And Caleb. Wanted in Kansas, Colorado, and Texas. He will face more charges than Crowe. Sheriff Boone placed his hat on his head. Your farm is safe now. Ruth watched the wagons carry Crowe and his men down the eastern road. For the first time since Thomas had died, she believed those words. Elias remained in bed for nearly 3 weeks. Ruth changed the bandage every morning. Noah cared for Flint and repaired the bullet holes in the barn. The story of the fight traveled quickly. People came from Briar Creek to see the farm and stare at the old man, who had once been Dodge City's most feared gunslinger. The same men who had laughed at Ruth in the Red Lantern Hotel now spoke of Elias in lowered voices. Elias wanted none of their attention. When visitors came, he stayed inside or walked to the cottonwood tree where Thomas was buried. One evening, Ruth found him there. You never told me why they feared you in Dodge City, she said. Elias rested one hand on the fence. I was fast. That cannot be the whole story. No, but it is the part people remember. What is the part they forget? He looked at Thomas's grave. That every man who falls leaves someone waiting for him to come home. Ruth stood beside him. You saved us. I did what I should have done for my sister. You did more than that. Elias looked toward Noah, who was repairing the barn roof. The boy saved himself. He only needed someone to tell him fear did not make him weak. And what did I need? Elias met her eyes. To remember that Crowe had not taken everything from you. Ruth felt tears rise, but she did not turn away. A week later, Elias carried his saddle from the barn. Ruth saw him from the kitchen window and hurried outside. "You are leaving." "My shoulder works again." "That was not my question." Elias placed the saddle over Flint's back. "Crowe is gone. The sheriff has men watching the road. You do not need a guard anymore." Noah came around the barn. "There is work here." "There is always work somewhere." Ruth walked closer. "You said trouble follows men like you." "It does." "Then perhaps it is time you stopped walking alone when it finds you." Elias looked at her. The hard calm in his eyes disappeared for a moment. Ruth held out a small cloth bag. "Your $38. He did not take it. "I earned it." "You earned more than I could ever pay." Elias looked toward the farmhouse, the repaired barn, the clean well, and the wheat moving beneath the morning wind. Then he looked at Noah. The boy said nothing, but his face carried the question he was too proud to ask. Finally, Elias removed the saddle from Flint. "I suppose the western fence still needs work." Noah smiled. "It is nearly falling down." Ruth closed her hand around the money. "Then you had better stay until it is fixed." Elias carried the saddle back into the barn. The western fence took all summer to repair. By the time autumn came, no one in Briar Creek laughed at the widow's old guard. Some still whispered about Dodge City and the men Elias had faced there. Ruth knew the truth was simpler. The most feared gunslinger in Dodge City had not come to the Calloway farm looking for another fight. He had come looking for one last chance to arrive before it was too late. This time he had